Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and since 2010, I have interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of songwriters about the writing process. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So I've always been interested in treating songwriters the same way that we treat poets and traditional prose writers, as writers, plain and simple. There is no talk of how bands get their name, favorite tour stories, favorite foods, band drama, or anything else. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers as we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process. That's it, nothing else. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the podcast, Denison Witmer. But first, if you did not see my podcast episode last week with Benmont Tench, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, keyboardist, please check it out. The guy's a legend. He tells a great story in the interview about how on stage one night with the Heartbreakers, the pattern on the back of Mike Campbell being the guitarist for Tom Petty, a pattern on the back of Mike Campbell's shirt inspired Benmont Tench to change a riff or to improvise a riff. Just seeing that pattern gave him an idea for a riff. Well, I've got great news. Said wearer of that shirt, Mike Campbell, is going to be on the pod next week. Guitarist for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He has a new memoir out called Heartbreaker. We're going to talk about the memoir. We'll talk about songwriting. So please stay tuned for that one. Back to Denison Witmer. He has a new album out called Anything at All on Asthmatic Kitty Records, produced and also features Sufjan Stevens, a longtime friend and collaborator. Before the podcast, I'd written down the title of a Mary Oliver poem. I wrote down Mary Oliver's name, the title of the poem, because one of Whitmer's songs on his album reminded me of that Mary Oliver poem. So about halfway through the podcast, as you'll hear, he mentions Mary Oliver and how much of a fan he is. And when he did that, I knew we were in for a great conversation. Any conversation with a songwriter where we can talk about the influence of running and poetry separately, I'm going to have a blast with, as someone who loves poetry and runs. We talk a lot about how running, he said, when I'm being physically active, my brain opens up. The big impact physical activity has on his creative process. Whitmer is also a woodworker, and we talked about that as well. But the actual act of running really makes him so creative. But speaking of that role of motion, he tells a story about renting a van or buying a van, a cheap van for one of his early tours, I think. And about 200 miles into the tour, which, spanned thousands of miles, the radio gave out. So he had nothing to listen to. And he said that riding in that old van in silence forced him to become comfortable with his thoughts and was a great place for creativity. So a lot of talk about motion during the podcast and the impact that has. But we talked a lot about poetry, and we talked about Lee Young Lee, who is my favorite poet. And it's too bad you're not going to see my reaction during the pod because there's no video here. When he mentions his favorite poet is Lee Young Lee, and I almost dropped out of my chair. Lee Young Lee is my favorite poet. I interviewed him for the site a few years ago, and I just don't hear his name mentioned very often. But please check out Lee Young Lee, fantastic poet. So a lot in this discussion about physical activity, about literature, about poetry, and just the contemplative nature of Whitmer's songs. Really reminds me a lot of those romantic poets as well. So there's a lot going on here. Anyway, again, Denison Witmer's album Anything at All is out now on Asthmatic Kitty Records. And here is my interview with Denison Witmer. This is the earliest interview I've ever done. When I interview songwriters and talk to their press people, and they say, "Oh, it's got to be on the early side," and then they say like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So We're doing this at 9 o'clock in the morning, which I'm a big fan of. We have
Yeah,
four kids, and so I love early morning stuff.
right.
But I'm guessing because we're doing this early, are you an incredibly disciplined writer?
I am also in the same boat as you, where I have two kids. And my mornings are now, I'm up at 6 every day. And I just find that if I put the things that I feel like are important to me, like in the beginning of the day, that I'm more emotionally available and I'm more intellectually available. I haven't made so many decisions over the course of the day where I'm experiencing that decision fatigue. So for me, it's a really nice part of the day just to wake up. If I can get a guitar in my hands, if I can get to a place where I can write and be creative, I get a lot of good work done in the morning.
I wrote down the phrase decision fatigue. You said that, and I like that. I've never heard that before, but it reminds me. And we'll talk about revision later, but I had on Mary Timony, the guitarist, a few months
Yeah,
ago,
I love her music.
and yeah, and she said that she writes in the morning, and I love this idea. I've never forgotten it. She writes in the morning, but revises at night because she's a different person at night. And I've always said, as a prose writer, I'm not a songwriter, that the key to revision is distance. The closer you are to something, the harder it is to see it in a new perspective. But I love the fact that she says that, hey, in that 12-hour space, I've been through things that have made me a different person. And I love that idea. So I guess, is that something you do as well, as far as that giving it distance in the revision process? We'll get into that right away.
I definitely do. I mean, it's not that I don't trust what's happening when I'm being creative, but it's that I recognize from years of doing, of writing, that oftentimes I need to have a little distance from that brain dump. Like if I can create a space where I can just be an unedited creator and not worry about it, not think too much about what's happening, just let it flow. And then just get some distance between that time and when I come back to it and just try to make sense of it. I definitely am a different person. I love that she says she's a different person because I recognize that. My life isn't always that way. Sometimes the revisions are the next morning. It's not like morning and night kind of thing. And even though, I might sound very disciplined, I just try to make myself available whenever I can to the creative process, since my time is kind of pushed into the fringes now. Um, and so that can be any time of day, really. But I found it's mostly in the morning and mostly late at night. Yeah.
So has having kids, I mean, I think that the irony when I interview songwriters who have children, and like I said, we have four kids, um, that makes them more disciplined and more, I think often more prolific, because if I tell you, all right, you got 12 hours, most people probably mess around for 11 and a half. But if I say the kid's down for a nap, and our kids, are older now, but the
Yeah.
kid's down for a nap, you got 1 hour, you're going to get stuff done. And so, do you find that, and I find as a writer for me that certainly is helpful. So, do you find that has made you more disciplined?
It has. It didn't come easy though. I would say that when my kids were younger, they're now 9 and 13. It's a little easier now. But those younger years, it was a wake up call in a lot of ways because I used to have all this time that would stretch out in front of me, and then you go through the phase where you're just like, what did I do with all the time that I had now that now that I just have this hour here, hour there, kind of thing. Um, and then you start to appreciate it, right? Because then you go, oh, this is just making me a lot more scheduled and a lot more focused when I need to be. So, I mean, I have a lot of friends who don't have kids, and they still create in the same ways that I used to before I have children. And I have no complaints about that. I get it. I've been there. That's just not my life. I had to acclimate. And that acclimation wasn't the easiest process, but I'm thankful for it. Now on the other side of it, I see, okay, I figured it out. And I kind of can't imagine it another way. Like when I look back at like my time before children, I'm like, man, I could have used some of this discipline. I probably would have got more done back then had I had the same type of discipline that I have now. But, you can only go forward. You can't go back. So it's just the way it is.
So is there a ritual? I mean, I certainly have rituals to my writing. Like, for example, if I write in this chair, I always revise in that chair behind me. That's an active part of my ritual. Like, I deliberately say, and if I'm not in this room, I'll write somewhere else, but I'll never write and revise in the same place.
Right.
Um, and I do think there are important parts of the ritual that make me more effective. So, how important is a ritual, whether it is time of day or place or chair, certain things you have to have with you? Is how important is that?
I wish I was a little bit more ritualistic, but the reality is that the way I write is that I start on a guitar and I just play ideas, and so I have a guitar hanging in most every room of my house, somewhere close by, so that if something's turning over in my mind, I can grab it and play. And I basically come up with melodies, and then I just ad lib whatever's on my mind, and then I let that start to take shape. Um, and once that starts to take shape, then I just try to follow that idea. I've had to learn to write lyrics like in just different ways, and I feel like that my lyrics never really finish until I record. Even though I have a song, I might play it live and it exists in one way. Sometimes it's when I get into the studio that I realize that listening back to it, I don't like the phrasing or I don't like something's like bothering me and I need to even revise further. So I feel like I never quite write a song until I record it. Um, Even though that's not always the formula. Um, and sometimes I work on my lyrics while I go for a jog. That's another thing. I find that when I'm being physically active, my brain opens up and I allow myself to kind of just pull these random things together that might not necessarily make sense, but they do in that creative space, and I I write a lot of lyrics while I go for a run, for sure. That's just definitely a creative space for me.
Okay, so many follow-ups.
Yeah,
Here's the first one, and this is gonna sound extremely specific, but I find that when people write like you do, when they have guitars in different rooms, there are some who, when they're playing guitar, I know this is gonna sound really specific, but there are some that when they have that guitar, they're standing, others are walking around, others are sitting. Have you ever thought about what you're doing when you have that guitar with you?
I'm doing all of the above.
You are, okay.
Yeah, so I have a little step stool in my kitchen, and it sits by the back window, and it's right next to where I make my coffee. And on weekends, without fail, I will wake up first, go downstairs, make coffee, grab a guitar, sit on the step stool, look out over the backyard, and that's my time to just like write before the house wakes up. Sometimes my wife is up too. She's out, but she recognizes like that's the space. I'm playing guitar, I'm doing my thing. But once my kids are up, the guitar strap goes on. I walk around the house holding the guitar. And my last record was written on a guitar that I actually bought for my children. I bought this like 3/4 size like children's guitar, and it's so light and it's so easy to play that I found myself just wearing that guitar like it was like another piece of clothing and just walking around the house carrying it, whether or not it was like on my back doing something. And then I would turn it around and play my idea a little bit more and then put it back on my back and keep doing something else. But it's it's um it's like no way that I've ever been before, but it's just the byproduct of my lifestyle right now.
So that I love that idea though that you grab that cup of coffee and you sit down on that step stool. So, but is that a deliberate, like for me at least, it's okay. I deliberately say to myself, I will write here and revise somewhere else. So, are you actively aware that okay, this is the thing I need to do in the morning?
Yes and no. Like I said before, I wish I was a little bit more disciplined. I think it just goes in phases for me because and I'm sure you recognize this as a writer, that I think so much of the work that we do is not it's not perceptible to other people. Like you're working on something all the time. Like that's just the way my brain goes. Like if I have an idea that I'm turning over, especially when I'm in the writing phase of a record, my wife recognizes that there's part of me that might be like a little bit more distant just because there's a lot going on. I'm just turning over a lot of ideas and things. And so I have to then, create the space to get those ideas out, and that's when it becomes more intentional. So, it's very sporadic. It's like it's not a day in, day out thing. I have another job as well. So sometimes I'm just deep in carpentry and I can't get to those thoughts to get them out, or they just end up being like little iPhone notes or something, which end up just being prompts more than anything. Like they're just a couple words that I go, okay, I know I'm going to come back to that. And I hope that prompt jogs my memory when I'm sitting down to write, to remember the other things that I was thinking about alongside of it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
So is there an urgency then? Let's talk about those notes, because songwriters always tell me they have thousands of notes, on their
Yeah.
phone, and they rarely go back to them. And there's also no organization. They just frantically go back and search those things. So you're comfortable then with saying, I'll jot this down now, but I'll come back to it later. And rather than saying, okay, this is urgent, I have to address this now.
Yeah, I'm very comfortable with that. And I also kind of just accept that if I lose an idea, if it's important enough, it'll come back to me. I'll find it again. And that happens in the most random ways. Sometimes I'll have a voice memo that I've recorded like 6 or 7 years ago. And when I am going to compile all the songs for my album, I'll stumble across it and I'll be like, oh, wow, there's a lyric in there that I totally forgot about, but it works in this new song. Or like this melody is really cool and I need to finish this song and I'll come back to it. Yeah, I leave a lot to divine providence, whatever you want to call it. I try to make that space, because I always feel like at my best, anything that I'm working on is a collaboration, that's somewhat outside of me. That I'm just trying to open a window and let the light pass through, and on my best days, that's what's happening in a very unfiltered way. And then sometimes, it's just it's a lot more work. Um, but that's also kind of a byproduct of parenting in some ways, because when I became a parent, I realized that having kids is this very creative project, and I'm not saying that to diminish, what parenting actually is, or say that I control them. It's actually not control. It's the understanding that you are responsible for someone. You're creating something, but you're collaborating because your child has their own set of ideas and interests and things that they don't like. And they might not necessarily align with yours, but if they don't rub against your moral code, then your job is to support them or try to steer them in some way. And I think that, being a creative person in other ways, it mirrors that in some ways. Ultimately, I have the final say in what goes into my songs or what doesn't go into my songs, and that's different than parenting. But I always love when it feels like it gets away from me a little bit and I have to kind of rein it back in and shape it, and also accept that maybe it has its own agenda. Um,
I want to get back to what you said earlier, and that is, when I was a professor, I told my students this, and I believe 100% what you said. If you're a writer and you only think that the writing process is taking place as you're putting pen to paper, you'll fail. But you have to understand that your writing process is taking place when you're not aware of it. And I heard you say that, but your writing process is taking place when you are sleeping, eating, walking. Something is always happening up there.
yeah.
And you have to think that way as a writer. And I think that's so important. So I love that you said that, but that's so true.
It is true. And I think a lot of people put, I think, undue pressure on themselves to have to pump out some kind of content, and what I mean by content is obviously we're not talking about digital creation here. We're talking about pumping out some kind of writing that they can look back on and be like, okay, I accomplished this many words today and I did this. And that's all fine and good. That's a good goal to have. But, my wife is also a writer, and she and I take turns kind of going away to hotels for like a few days at a time, where it's like, if I'm really deep in a project, I'm just like, babe, I'm going to get a hotel. I'll be local. You know where I am if you need me, but I'm just going to this place so that I can have just an unfiltered environment, where I can just work, work, work. And she said to me, she was like, well, I want to go to this hotel, and I don't know, if I'll work or what I'll do. And I always remind her, I said, look, if you just sleep, that's still work, because when you wake up from that, you're in a space where you're more available than you were before. And you just have to trust your body, and you have to trust that that's all part of the process. It's all one big thing. And I think it's all equally important, resting yourself, working yourself hard, um, and being kind to yourself is the other big thing, not beating up on yourself. I definitely think there's a time to edit and say, okay, this isn't working, this doesn't, but there's no sense in being like, I suck, I'm no good, and the comparison game is a really, really dark place. You can only be the person that you are. You can only fill the space that you fill. And if you can put those things into perspective and then just allow yourself to be free and create freely, I think you get a lot more work done.
I interviewed probably 10 years ago the writer Anthony Doerr. He wrote the book All the Light We Cannot See.
Oh yeah,
Um,
for sure.
and I interviewed him, but before I just started focusing on songwriters, I was interviewing novelists and poets for my site, and he had not written All the Light We Cannot See. He was actually writing it during that around that same time. And I asked him about writer's block, and he gave me a quote I'll never forget. He said, "I don't believe in writer's block." He called writer's block a failure of courage. In
Interesting.
other words, you can't be afraid to write the bad stuff. And writer's block happens because you think, oh, the page isn't ready for this yet. I'm going to wait until it's. And he's like, no, you're not that special. Just get it down. And it reminds me, I've got this quote up here by William Faulkner. William Faulkner said, get it down, take chances. It may be bad, but it's the only way you can do anything good. And, I love the essay by the novelist Anne Lamott, and it's called Shitty First Drafts. And
Mhm.
I live by that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'd love to get your take on that. And I think that's, the whole failure of courage. I never thought of it that way, because I don't believe in it. You know, anyone can write anything. You're not that good.
Well, it is, yeah, it is I can understand it is a failure of courage in some ways. I think it's hard for different people to tap into different things. People back themselves into corners all the time. I mean, we're all guilty of it. Um, I came across a quote. This is probably going on like 15 to 20 years ago, and I'll tell you a little secret that I've actually never told anyone but it ties to what we're saying. But I came across this quote, and it said, if the desire to write is not followed by actual writing, then the desire is not to write. And it's like, I was like, oh, I see what they're doing there. They're saying, if you're not actually doing it, then, the desire is not to actually do it. And I think when I initially read that, it was like a very strong call to action to me. It's like, but the desire is to write. I must write, And now I kind of see it as just like, well, it's a cyclical thing. Sometimes I do have the desire to write, and I can't. And that's just I've had to accept that. Or sometimes the desire, if the desire to write isn't followed by writing, it just means, yeah, I'm not in a space where I can. But when I first saw that quote, what I did is I made a bunch of postcards for my friends who are writers, and I printed that quote in black ink on black paper on a postcard. And I didn't sign it. I didn't do anything. I just put their address on the other side, and I mailed it to them just to see, if it would be a call to action to anyone, because you get this piece of paper in the mail and it's black and you have to turn it at an angle and then you finally see this thing, which is so elusive, because writing is so elusive as it is. It feels like you're trying to draw black ink off of a black page anyway, And so I just wanted my friends to see that and be like, oh, what does that mean for me? More and more, just to like challenge them, maybe they threw it in the trash. I have no idea. I only got one response from one of my friends in Seattle that was just like, I got this postcard. I saw it on the refrigerator. This was like 2 years later. I saw it on the refrigerator and they were like, I got this random thing in the mail. I was like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. But never said it, never mentioned that it was me.
That is hilarious. Okay, so this is a multi-part question here, and you had mentioned, as a woodworker, um, and I'm curious if are ideas coming to you? Do you use that time when you're not engaged, when you're engaged in other creative pursuits, for example, woodworking? Is that a restful time where you deliberately aren't thinking about songs because that will make you stronger later as a songwriter, or is that a time when ideas come to you? And so before you answer that, I think that's also the bigger discussion to me, and I hear this a lot from songwriters, is that they get ideas when their brains are engaged in unconscious activities. So the number of times songwriters tell me, Mark Morton, the guy I co-wrote the book with, he's told me he gets a lot of song ideas when he's gardening. So I had Kebmo on, and Kebmo told me folding laundry, and I
Yeah.
hear vacuuming, cleaning. So the ideas come to us when when our brains are engaged in an unconscious activity. That's when the conscious thoughts, that's when the unconscious thoughts kind of bubble up. So anyway, I'd love to have that discussion, only because I find that fascinating and that's kind of where the eureka moments, why we get our best ideas in the shower. So anyway, have at it. That's a big topic, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I'm definitely the same way. I definitely experience more epiphany, when I'm not actively sitting trying to force something out. So in the wood shop, I do have a lot of time to think, because it's loud. I'm in ear protection. If I'm not listening to an audiobook or music, I'm just deep in my thoughts. And once the math is all sorted out and I'm just executing, putting something together, I'm just being creative with my hands, and it allows my mind to open up. Like I said earlier about going for a run, that's another time where I get a lot of those eureka moments happen. And if you listen to my new album, I'd say my last two albums, American Foursquare and Anything at All, are kind of about what's about relocating back to Lancaster, where I live now, and parenting children, and domestic life, and drawing meaning from those things that are directly around me, and so folding the laundry, I have a lyric about folding laundry on my last record.
How did I miss that? Oh, wait, not on the new on the
Not
latest
on the
one?
new one, not on the new
Oh, okay,
one, but
okay.
on the one before, for sure. And on the new record, I have a lot of lyrics about gardening and bird watching, and these are things that they're all very thought provoking to me, and very meaningful. And so those little snippets, and it's I challenge myself to think about, I think it's, is it Mary Oliver who said, like, what you do with your one precious life, those things are so important to me. Like, I come back to that over and over again. And so I just try to be present and available. And I love when the thoughts come, the epiphanies come, you always feel like it's a gift when you figure something out. And sometimes you realize, like, oh, I'm just repeating something somebody else said, or I'm having the same epiphany as somebody else said. But I always try to remind people, especially younger writers who are trying to, learn to find their own voice, that it is totally fine to fall into cliches sometimes, that things are new to you the first time they happen to you. And just because it might have happened to somebody else, or somebody else might have written it the way that you wish you wrote it or somebody else wrote something that really touches you. It just means that's part of the human experience. And it's like, and you are at full liberty to write it in the way that you experience it as well. And if at times that leans into what you feel like might be copying someone, figure out a way to say it in your own way, but don't shy away from writing about the things that are happening to you, because it's important for you to process those things.
So no one can see this, but I actually have on my pad of paper Mary Oliver, because we were going to talk about Mary Oliver
Oh,
today.
really?
So
Wow.
yes,
Oh, fantastic.
it's actually on this piece of paper here because I have. So your lyric. This is it's amazing that you said that. So in your song "Older and Free," the wind as it rushes through the trees, it's poetry, and then that reminded me of the Mary Oliver poem "When I Am Among the Trees."
Oh yeah, that's a great one. It's a great one. I love Mary Oliver. I have a song that's coming out later in the year where I actually just reference her name because she's such an important writer to me. Um, and I would be less of a person if it wasn't for her poetry. There's a few poets that I really lean into heavily. One of them is Lee Young Lee. Is just one of my favorite poets of all time. And I have an album from 2005 called "Are You a Dreamer?" And I was dealing with a lot of themes of sleep and dreaming and the creative space that happens when we dream or when we're in that surreal space. Um, and Lee Young Lee's book, The Book of My Nights, was very important to the creation of that record for me personally. Another one, Larry Levis, is a great poet that I love. And I've been reading a lot of Gerald Stern these days, mostly because I read some interviews with Lee Young Lee. There's a book called Breaking the Alabaster Jar that I absolutely love. And he referenced Gerald Stern in that book. And so I was like, well, I guess I have to read Gerald Stern now. So, yeah.
I don't know where to begin with even my response to that, because I'm going to show you when we're done with this. There's a closet behind me where I have, so Leon Lee and Galway Kinnell are my two all-time favorite poets.
Okay.
Um, and I have a reading. I went to see a Lee Young Lee reading here outside of DC in 1990, I think 4. And I've got that cassette of the reading
Oh,
back
wow.
there that
Really? Oh, that's
yes.
incredible.
And somehow I will try to get it to you because it's him reading. I got a chance to meet him. I interviewed him a few years ago.
Really?
And also, so Lee Young Lee and Gerald Stern both came to Hope College and I was there because and they both read together.
Really?
Um,
Oh, man.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
incredible.
they gave a reading together. But Lee Young Lee, I mean, no one's ever mentioned him in my 15 years of doing this, so that's why I'm almost speechless that you mentioned him, because he kind of, I think he and Galway Kinnell is another one that are kind of on
I'm gonna
another
have to
level
look up
for me.
Galway Canal for sure.
Yeah. So Lee Young Lee said something in this interview, when I interviewed him, and he said that he found beauty in the bed sheets when he and his wife wake up in the morning. Okay. So most people see a messy bed. He saw the beautiful outlines of bodies in the morning bed sheets. And he just said this to me. This wasn't a
Yeah.
poem. And I just got, I thought, first of all, that's why he's a poet and I'm not,
Right, I was
because
thinking the same
I
thing.
see a bed that needs to be made. And he
Right.
saw the outlines of bodies in the bed sheets. And it just blew my mind because that's what poets do. I mean, they see the beauty in the mundane. um, I could talk about Lee Young Lee for days.
Yeah, I mean, poets, that's a whole another thing. And what I mean by that is I just feel like when all you're leaning on is just the words, and then sometimes very few, um the intentionality behind all of that feels like the next level to me. I could only aspire to hope that I could write like that, and I'm thankful a lot of times that I have music to carry things, because sometimes music kind of dictates the phonetics of the words as well. Like sometimes a turn of phrase might not be as poetic on the page, but it sounds better phonetically in a song. So I definitely play around with that. I will say this though, I only got to see Lee Young Lee read one time. It was at Calvin College in Michigan. We were both at the same. There was like a music and writers festival, and we both happened to be there. And I was really thankful that I was not performing at the same time that he was reading because I got to go. And he read a bunch of his poems, and what I experienced from that was that the poems that didn't necessarily hit me in the same way when I read them had so much more gravity when he was reading them. And some of the poems that I loved felt different in his voice than they were in mine, in a sense. So it's like it's very interesting how that can change and how things can connect with us just through the conduit, through the delivery, whether it be yourself, your own cadence when you're reading poems, or the cadence of someone else delivering the poem to you. Um, and I really liked that. I was glad to see that I got a copy of his book Behind My Eyes from a few years ago, and I had a CD in the back of it of him reading the poems, and I initially would have frowned at something like that had I not been to see him read before. I would have been like, I don't need that. But I, I absolutely read the book cover to cover. Then I put the CD on and listened to them to see which poems changed for me as a result of them being in his voice.
I think all songwriters should read poetry, but the number of songwriters who tell me they read poetry, I still say I can count on maybe two hands now at this point, but not that many.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. See,
oh
that's
yeah.
how it started for me, and this goes way back to high school. Before I learned to play a guitar, I thought I was a poet. I had a creative writing teacher who we took some poetry classes and we all wrote poems, and I felt like, oh, this is a really great way to express myself. And then when I turned 16, my oldest brother, who was in bands and very creative, and um, he was like, well, you should get a guitar, and I was like, okay, I'll get a guitar. And I got a guitar. And then all of a sudden it was like, I never learned how to play other people's songs. I was never a cover artist. I don't read music. I did take some guitar lessons eventually, but when I first started playing guitar, I had all these musical ideas and I thought, well, now I need words. And so I went back to my poems and I just tried to put the poems over music. And I think that kind of informed the way that I write, as a wannabe poet, quote unquote, with music for sure.
Does fiction move you the same way?
It does. Yeah. It's a different brain space. I mean, I don't write fiction. That's just not the way my brain works. I've tried to write from another person perspective, and maybe successfully a couple times. But this is not because I'm overly self-involved. It's just my creative process is a little bit that way. It's my way of processing. It's my way of coming to terms with the world. I need that to just make sense of my everyday. And so my music is definitely more rooted in that it is about me. And it's okay. It's just one part of me, and maybe it's the part that the public knows the most because of the fact that I release music and, that's what's publicly available. But most of my friends would know that I'm not that self-involved in the rest of my life.
Is there a genre or authors that you gravitate towards when it comes to fiction?
Um, yeah, let's see, I'm trying to think of the last couple books that I read. Um, I've been kind of into books about the woods. So I read and this is terrible because I'm blanking on some of the names of the authors right now. But my favorite book of the last year was The Overstory. It was written. I mean, it's not from last year, but it was from a few years ago. And I loved The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. That was a really important book to me. I went through a big John Irving phase last year where I revisited A Prayer for Owen Meany, A Widow for a Year. I love a lot of John Irving's writing. And I'm also a big Haruki Murakami fan. I definitely read everything that Murakami releases. Um, Yeah. I'm okay with the surreal. You know, Murakami leans farther into the surreal than some people do. You know, the overstory is just rooted in, you know, the history of trees and and America kind of coming of age and how these trees stand beside us, you know, in silence, but they're speaking to us, you know, and how different people relate to them, and that's very much rooted in reality. Whereas Murakami is not afraid to just go into that like really weird dream space, and I've got room for both of those things for sure.
And Murakami wrote the book about running, right? What I think about when I think about running or
Yeah,
something along.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. That I think that's what it's called, and that's kind of a play on the Richard Carver book. You know what we talk about when we talk about writing. Is that what it
Yeah.
is? Yeah.
Yeah, something like
Um,
that. So I want to ask because we've mentioned jogging a couple times, and I'm a big runner as well, and how fruitful that is for you for ideas. Um, do you find that, and this is going to be very specific, but do you find that the inspiration may change based on the route that you take, or because I think for me, like if I and I hear this a lot, like people say walking, biking, hiking, running, driving, of course. Then we can discuss whether it's self locomotion or
yeah,
locomotion versus
sure.
wheels. um but if you're more prolific, if you're exercising in a familiar space, because your brain has more time to wander and less time to focus on where am I going practically.
Right. Yeah, I think I have a few routes that I run around Lancaster, and I've kind of fallen into one particular route over and over again. And my wife is always ribbing me about that because she's just like, why don't you explore, you know, different places, you know? And I'm like, well, I know what the mileage is on this. I know what I'm getting into. And it's about the physical exercise, but it's also about just turning my brain off a little bit, you know, and she notices a lot more when she runs than I do. I tend to go inward, and you know, it's not that I don't see what's happening around me. I absolutely do, you know, and different seasons of running, um, you know, bring different things to the forefront as well, lyrics or different ideas that pop up just from things that I see. But um, being in motion is always really good for me mentally. And I think that might be the result of having been a touring musician through what I would consider like very formative creative years, you know, my early 20s through my 30s. I was touring a lot and driving, you know, between shows and, you know, just putting all those miles in and watching scenery go by and becoming familiar with different parts of the country and, you know, looking forward to those things, but also sometimes just being able to kind of like tune it out because I knew that I was going from point A to point B. Um, I'll tell you a story. One of my very first tours, I bought an old van from my parents, this old like Chevy Beauville van, and they were looking to get rid of it. And I was like, that's going to be a tour vehicle for me. You know, I'm going to go see the country and do this, you know. So I bought it from them. And the second day of that tour, the radio broke. And I was too poor to put a new radio in it. And I ended up doing 25,000 miles in silence, you know, and that changed me. It forced me to learn to be comfortable with myself and my thoughts. And I am forever thankful for that moment of just driving and driving and driving and thinking.
I interviewed James McMurtry like 10 years ago, and he was in his car during the interview. He was driving,
Oh, wow.
and it was amazing because as he was driving, he was commenting on the signs and the billboards he was seeing, and I was thinking, holy shit, I may be witnessing real time a James McMurtry song being
Yeah.
written
Yeah.
because he was commenting on all the phrases he was seeing, and it was so cool to listen to. Um, but then I think there's the idea of self locomotion, like I said, is running, and I don't know the answer to this, but are we creative? Is the creative process different when we're running versus when we're driving?
Yeah. I mean, it might be. It definitely can be. like I said before, I do find that when I'm being physically active, I do have I have a different access to my brain. I don't know what it is. It's something else opens up. Another part of me opens up, and I feel like I can just access different things, different turns, or something will come to me that I've been working on for a really long time, and I just haven't found a way to say it. I don't know that it's exclusive to running, but I know that it comes easier when I'm being physically active, for sure.
And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, you can find all the episodes on all major streaming platforms and also at the Songwriters on Process website. That is at songwritersonpodcast.com. Pre-2020, this was not a pod. I was transcribing all of the interviews. So you can find all of them, hundreds of them, many hundreds of them, on the Songwriters on Process website. You'll find both the transcribed interviews and the pod there. Take a deep dive, spend a day. These are great conversations with songwriters just about the writing process. Also, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, is out now worldwide on Hachette Books. You can find it online in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God, and it's his memoir. Again, that is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari. I am biased, but that's a damn good book. My email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love suggestions, questions, comments. People always email me and tell me who they want to see on the pod next. You never know. Send me an email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. That's it for me, everyone. Have a great day.